welcome back to the new time machine. And I'm here again with Alan Harris, which is a huge honor for the second part in our talk. And we're going to start talking about skepticism. And there's actually an article that he wrote with Clark Chapman about skepticism and changes in American society about 9/11. And I would like him to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, Clark and I wrote an article on the first anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and the point of that article was that, as terrible as that event was, it is really a fairly minor perturbation on the lives of most people, and perhaps should be kept that way. We pointed out in that article that during the month of September of 2001, more people were killed in automobile accidents in the United States than died in the 9/11 attacks. As the monthly death toll on American highways is about 3,000 a month, and it was only 2,000 and something killed in the trade towers. So in the larger scheme of things, your odds of dying in a terrorist attacks are being involved even are terribly, terribly small. And yet people seem to have this perception. And for example, news polls to people asking the question, what do you think is the chance in the next year that you or somebody you know or in your family will be involved in a terrorist act? Something like 20 or 30% of people thought that it was possible or likely. And yet the chances like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, a tiny, tiny number, that you would even know somebody. The main point of our article was that we shouldn't completely transform our society and our way of life. Airport security and all these other things should not be just changed dramatically in response to what turns out to be a very, very small risk. Curiously, when we wrote that article, we got the magazine Skeptical Inquirer received more correspondence in response to that article than any article they had published to that time. And most of it was hostile, I would have to say. Some of it bordered on being threats. The people who thought we were just completely off base and that we have to do these things and that the security is required and necessary and so on. And then we published another rejoinder article 10 years later, or 9 years later, on the 10th anniversary, and reiterated some of the similar points. And when we wrote that article, we got a much more friendly response. By that time, with the mellowing of 10 years, a much larger fraction of the readership tended to agree with us, that we had really gone out of the way.
Yeah,
In our
I think the reason is kind of obvious, right? Emotion. It was
Yeah.
the emotions on the aftermath of 9/11 were sky high, and people were unable to look at it with some ground of objectivity, right? So
Yeah.
so
We're seeing the same thing right now in the United States with this spate of gun violence in schools, of mass shootings in schools, where again, if you actually look at the statistics, even though it's a terrible thing when somebody goes into a school with a gun and shoots 10 or 20 people, it turns out nationwide in the United States, more children are killed being driven to school and back than chance to be killed by gunmen in school. And so where should we be putting our priorities? It seems that in the case of these shootings, it would seem that they're completely senseless and shouldn't occur, and they do. So we can't say they don't happen. But on the other hand, they're not transformative in that children should not have to have drills every day to hide under their desks, or 2/3 of the schools in the country now have drills to teach the children how to respond if a gunman comes into the room. Well,
and and keeping people scared is one of the ways to control them. That's one of
yes,
the,
exactly.
trying to scare people. It's a very effective way to control them, to get them to do what you want them to do. So
Yes.
there's a whole, and in the thing about guns, it's interesting because, and school shootings is, they're doing all this stuff, but they're not doing the basic thing that the other developed countries did, which is background checks on
Yeah.
people, see if they have a history of violence, history of mental illness, creates a test so if to see if the person is capable to own a gun. I mean, if you want to
Yeah.
drive, if you want to have a car and drive, you have to pass a series of tests, right? But in the
Yes.
United States, if you want a gun and you go to a gun show, you don't
You
need
just
to.
go there and get
You just go and get
it.
a truly powerful killing machine without any kind of control, and
Yeah.
that's recipe. I don't know if you agree with me, but it's a insanity recipe,
Yeah.
because that's
Yes.
crazy. That's
Yeah, I agree.
th- th-
Yeah, you mentioned the role of fear, and I had another person that I met some time ago, Pete Warden, who's a general in the Air Force, and was the director of Ames Research Center for a period of time, and so on. And in casual conversation one time, he made the point. He said that in deciding public policy, public programs, whether it's a space program or whatever, these programs are driven by greed, fear, or curiosity. Unfortunately, in that order. And we've seen that greed is number one. People will do anything for money, it seems. Fear is number two. People, if you can generate fear in people, you can get approval to do just about anything. And curiosity, he was referring to the space program, is number three. He said, unfortunately, we're number three.
and I will argue that curiosity is the most important drive in human
Yes,
understanding.
should be exactly the other way around.
Yeah, and greed. I mean, greed is actually connected to something that is just destroying democracy, because since democracy and private funding of political parties happen, who actually holds the power most of the time to select the candidates and stuff? It's big corporations and
That's
very wealthy individuals. I mean, people,
exactly, yeah.
and a very small minority of the population. And democracy is supposed to represent the interests. It should protect all minorities, but should represent the interests of the majority. And that's not happening because of that control, because of the greed.
And in part, it's not just personal greed, I think. The real problem we have is in setting up the design of corporations. I mean, the whole mode of a corporation is designed to enhance the profit of the corporation and distribute that then to whoever owns the corporation. I think that in a better view, the purpose of a corporation should be to serve the customer, you could say, and the employees and so on, but yet just the structure of a corporation is set up to serve the people that hold that own the corporation.
Majority shareholders. I mean,
yeah, and so then you end up with large armies of attorneys and lobbyists to Congress and so on, whose sole objective is to make sure that corporations have a clear way to maximize profit. Never mind providing service, just earning profit.
and if they destroy the environment on the way, who cares?
Yeah, and so again, almost like the population problem we were talking about in the last segment, I fear that we've gone over the tipping point on this. We have ceded too much power to too small of a moneyed interest to actually turn that around. The people that have gained that power and that money are not going to give in easily, and so that's what's paralyzing our government now. You know, you can blame Trump for all sorts of idiocy, but Trump is not alone in the problem in the
Of
United
course not.
States. A lot of it is just that the Congress has been thoroughly paralyzed by the moneyed interests, the lobbying forces, and so on, so that they can't actually accomplish what they would. You know, people coming into elected office come in with high ideals, like Obama when he became the president, had high ideals for reforming healthcare and so on, and what he finally managed to get by was just a mere shadow of what it really should have been and what he initially went in hoping to accomplish. And even that now is being dismantled by the present administration. So it's a very dismal view from my perspective.
And the power of the health industry is pretty big. I mean,
Oh yeah, yeah, that's
uh,
exactly the problem.
and they have a lot of power. They have control of many Congress people, senators, and I mean they finance their campaigns. And
Yeah,
when you give people money, it comes with strings. I mean,
yeah,
you don't give money away just.
yeah, yeah. When Medicare came into our country, when the Johnson administration put in Medicare, they had in mind right then to have universal health care in the United States, but Johnson and his advisors realized that they did not have the power to actually pull that off. But the Medicare law that we have in the United States was designed with the idea that it had all the provisions you needed for general universal health care. All you really had to do was just remove the age restriction. You know, just it's now for everybody instead of those over 65 and disabled people. Part of the having disabled people included in the same program was that allowed you to deal with problems of youth, children, people that needed birth control and maternity care and all those kind of things. Those are all in the Medicare bill, and yet those of us over 65 don't have a whole lot of use for that. But it's all there, so you don't have to write that into the law. All you really have to do is remove that one age 65 limit. But at this point in time, that just can't happen abruptly because you have this monstrous insurance industry and the health delivery industry and so on that won't let it happen. And so
That's actually the Bernie Sanders
so
proposal,
I don't
right?
know if they'll ever manage to get universal health care in this country. My own feeling that I expressed to several people is that perhaps the way to do it is gradually, where you would drop the age limit for Medicare by, say, 5 years every year, so that next year you only have to be 60 to be Medicare, then 55, then 50, and so on.
And
By the time you get
that would
by
create
the time you get
adjustments.
about 30 years age, it pretty well covers everybody because the ones younger than that are dependents. And so it would take about 10 years' time to gradually phase it in. And I think that would be less of a shock. It would give the insurance industry time to redo themselves and the healthcare systems to rearrange themselves. So I do have to agree that just saying on January 1st, Medicare is for everyone, you know, that would just be a calamity to our economy and everything else. So you kind of have to go at it slowly, but I actually don't think the prospects of doing it even slowly are very good because the powers that be, the insurance industry and so on, is just too powerful to get by with that.
Let me give you a little bit of hope. Uh, I saw a
Yeah,
poll that
geez.
actually showed that Bernie Sanders is currently the most popular politician in the United States. It's over 65% of approval. I mean, I don't know of any politician in the United States who gets anywhere near that kind of approval. And he has a plan, kind of like yours. I mean, he wants to maybe move it faster, but I think that's a strategy of negotiation. I mean, you go in and you put the most radical idea, but you know that you have to negotiate and you have to see it a little bit, and maybe a plan like yours could be implemented by a president if someday United States gets a Bernie Sanders like president. I mean,
Yeah.
I would really like a Brazilian Bernie Sanders. Unfortunately, we don't have it.
I see.
We don't have a Brazilian Bernie Sanders. If we do, I can assure you that I would be doing campaign for him or for her or whoever. But
Yeah.
and I will be engaged and stuff like that because I'm really about politics.
Yeah.
And but I don't see anybody that gets me that motivated in Brazilian politics. I mean, there are better options than others. I mean, we are in an election year, but
Hmm.
not anything that would make me that excited. I think is or
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
and, and and about the United States, maybe you can get someone that like that in the White House because I think the progressive movement is growing in the United States, and the failing of what I would call corporate Democrats, it's becoming ever more clear. I mean, the corporate wing of the Democratic Party is just losing everything. I mean, they lost
Yeah.
state legislatures, they lost the president, they lost Congress, they are kind of, I mean, it's hard to imagine someone losing that much. I mean, it's almost like their period in the Red Sox history. There was the curse of the Bambino, right? It was that they
Yeah.
lose, they always lose.
Well,
But
we'll have to see what happens in our November elections.
yeah, I hope you get a better
Hopefully.
Congress and a better Senate, maybe. But I
Yeah.
think it's a slow process. I mean, Trump is doing everything he can to help you guys in some sense, because backing out of the Iran deal and backing out of the Paris Accord, the Paris deal was,
Yeah.
I mean, the Paris deal is not enough, and even that. But in your country, there's a lot of people who deny climate change, right?
Yeah. Well, a fair amount of that is just confusion of the public, and I don't know. Well, politicians, of course, are to blame for a lot of that, and the media, I think, shares the blame in not taking a stronger position. We seem to have this mode in the media, well, two different modes. One is the idea of giving fair or equal treatment to both sides. Well, there are some things like the matter of climate change where fundamentally there really is only one side. You know, it's pretty obvious what is correct.
Because the evidence is there. I mean, the evidence is there. I think that's the logic of giving two opposing views equal platform. It breaks down when you talk about things like, oh, you're going to put people who deny the Holocaust in the same plane and people who say the Holocaust happened. I mean,
right. And so that's the one thing. The other thing is that the media has now gotten into the mode of promoting what sells. And it turns out that bad news sells, violence sells, these school shootings sell, so that if you want to sell your story and get the maximum readership so that you can get commercials coverage, you cover what sells. I just saw, with regard to these school shooting things, a commentary that back in, I think it was 1966, when there was a shooter at the top of the clock tower at University of Texas in Austin that sat up on the top of the tower and shot 20 or 30 people and injured lots more and so on. We didn't hear anything about that until the next day in the newscasts and stuff like that. Whereas now, when something like that happens, people on their cell phones and so on spread the word. Oh, the shooter just came in the front door or something. And the news helicopters are circling within minutes. And so all of a sudden there's live coverage of these things. That's very dramatic, and it draws customers, but it also instills fear. So that back then, when the Texas shootout happened, people just kind of say, "Oh, well, that's really too bad," and went on about their lives. And likewise, it wasn't until until the last decade or two when these things have suddenly become just like car chases on the freeway and that kind of thing that are being covered live as they happen. And
It seems almost like the car chases in movies are not enough. I mean, you have the people now demand the real thing, right?
oh yeah, here in Los Angeles on the news, you just turn on the local news, and every day there's a couple, 3 car chases, that are being covered live as they happen on the freeways of Los Angeles. And that's for the media. It sells copy, it sells readers, it gets viewers.
We got
Not
back.
me very much. My wife sees them. I don't. But I don't think that's constructive, and I don't know what to do about that. We're kind of stuck with this First Amendment business where the news media can do what they want and say what they want and so forth, and without restriction with regard to either truth or relevance. What is actually good for people to know. And,
That's an interesting point, because I'm a big defender of freedom of speech, but at the same time, I think there's some speech who should be promoted and others who don't. So, for instance, I think it would be in the role of a president who is progressive to promote science, to promote scientific speech in every sphere of the media. And I think I'm not in favor of restricting the media, but I think that good speech should be promoted. Speech about science, speech about stuff about education should be the Western Europe has some things that I think is in England has some things that I think is very interesting. They have a big tradition of public debates, and in that tradition of public debates, of putting really controversial issues on TV, they get people excited because it's a controversial issue, but they also get people thinking about big issues, politics, economics, social issues, and so that kind of mentality that chases tragedies, it's I would say lessened in those countries. So there is a solution without losing freedom, I think, but it requires a proactive measures, a series of proactive measures.
Mm-hmm.
And let me see here. Well, I think we cover a lot of ground in this segment. I was thinking about 9/11 and about terrorism, and one of the things that I think it doesn't get talked about a lot is United States. It's an ally of Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis are the biggest responsibles for spreading Wahhabism, which is an ideology which is extreme of Islam. So many times I think the United States has responsibility in stuff that happens in that field, because they allies themselves with theocracies. I mean, United States should not be an ally of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think originally, going back decades, that was driven to a large extent by Saudi Arabia being the largest oil producer and the United States being dependent on petroleum imports. That's actually rather turned around now. We may still be getting some imports from Saudi Arabia, but certainly not the majority, and the United States production is nearly self-sufficient, so that we're not a big importer of petroleum and certainly not dependent on it. The United States has adequate or very generous petroleum reserves offshore and so on. Some of it in places that we would prefer not to drill, but if we were isolated from the rest of the world's supply of petroleum and had to depend on our own, it is actually there. You know, like the North Slope in Alaska and offshore of California and the Gulf Coast and so forth. And we have one of the biggest reserves is the Lost Hills in California, which is up in the San Joaquin Valley, and is essentially set aside as a naval controlled reserve of oil, not to be used except to power the Navy if they were to have a war or something like that and need to provide their own. So we actually have very little cause to get back to Saudi Arabia. I don't think we have a logistical reason why we should be supporting them. And at this point, not that we should just turn them into enemies, but I think at this point they really need to earn our friendship rather than...
I agree with you completely. I would say this. If they want help of the United States, they have to start changing their society. They have to stop killing people in public squares. I mean, they are one of the biggest offenders in social rights and human rights in the world, and they help to spread one of the worst, most violent ideologies the world has ever seen. I mean, the United States should say to them, look, we can help you, we can do business with you, but you have to change. If you don't change, we do sanctions, we're not going to talk to you. I mean, I agree, not make them enemies, but start to talk to them like the way they deserve. I mean, they're not an example for the world in terms of society, and that's key, I think, for fighting terrorism. We talk about 9/11, and I agree with you completely. Terrorism, the risk for each individual, it's very small, but in terms of globally is a problem. And to deal with it, I think you have to deal with the ideology, to fight that ideology, and to try to promote a secular ideology, try to promote a democratic ideology, other things that try to replace theocracy. Because if you don't replace it, with funds, and Saudi Arabia has funds to help to spread that thing's going to keep giving us trouble. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but my wife's dream was actually do the honeymoon in France. And we met in Uruguay because they were happening. I actually picked up an article that said in France there were happening attacks, small ones, not big ones, but almost one each week. Small terrorist attacks and stuff like conflicts with terrorists in Paris in that month that we were planning our honeymoon. And we're like, look, the chances of that happening to us, it's minor. But when terrorist attacks, they do for tourist places, crowds, there is a chance. And you see how fear is powerful. We talk about, well, let's do first a trip here in South America. It's cheaper. We're not rich. We don't have that much money right now, so that makes sense in other ways. But it also, one of the things that was in our mind was the danger, because
I have to say, I'm on the one hand, I'm glad you didn't go to Paris because we wouldn't have met in Montevideo. But on the other hand, you probably should have gone to Paris. It's not that dangerous.
I agree.
I've been to France many times and Italy and so on, and I remember 20, 30 years ago when there was a terrorist attack in Rome airport or something like that, and I was in France. My mother was very worried that there was this act of terrorism at the Rome airport, and I was in the middle of Paris or something like that. I said, "Look, Mom, it's a big.
That's very far away.
Europe is as big as the United States, and it would be just like as if there's a terrorist attack in Texas and I'm in California. So what? It's not a big risk."
I agree, and we will plan a trip to Paris no doubt.
Oh,
But I'm glad I went to Uruguay, and one of the reasons is I met you guys.
uh-huh.
I'm gonna cut this part right now,
Okay.
and we're gonna do another segment in a little while. And if you like my work, please subscribe to the channel, share it because it's very important to me. Thank you.